What's going on, everybody? Gar Hoover here, and today we're going to be going through my track Circuit I made on the PO-33. And Circuit is pretty interesting. It's kind of cyberpunky. It's got some synthwave elements, some acid, some like mid-tempo dubstep, all shoved into one song. And I posted this video last night of the track. If you haven't listened to it, you can check it out up here. And your guys' response for a tutorial was insane. So I am going to just go for it right now and show you guys all the behind the scenes on how I made this track. And if you want to pick up the samples, feel free to check the description below to grab those. And with that being said, let's get started looking at this track. Alright, so we are back at the murder table, as it's been lovingly called by you all. And we are going to just start with the samples. Alright, so we've got this classic acid sound. There it is without any filtering. Pretty bassy, honestly. And then we have an alternative acid sound that kind of rings out a little bit longer. We got our bass sound with a little bit of reverb I added. And we got this kind of bit crushed bass tone. Sounds pretty awesome. Then we got this kind of like throwback horn sound that's from Massive. And we got this kind of weird pluck. Once again, it's got some filtering on it. You can hear it there, a lot more bass to it. And then we have this kind of detuned square wave pluck sound. And then for the drums, I have two of these because they're layered with the hi-hats. Same with the kick. You can hear that one's got the hi-hat. This one does not. And then we got the hi-hat sound right there. We've got this other snare sound. And then our open hi-hat, which kind of adds that energy. And then we have our kind of ambient noise from a video I took from YouTube of like New York City or something like that. And then we got this morphine dubstep sound I made in Massive. And then we have these two kind of fake guitar chords I made that are just like a power chord. So the root note, then the fifth of the chord, and then an octave. And it, once again, made in Massive, and then I threw an amp on it, a fake amp, and kind of got this fake rock sound, which is really good because it fits the tone well. It kind of gives it that old throwback, maybe even SNES type of feel, and kind of adds that fun throwback flair to it. And that's going to do it for the samples. Now we're going to take a look at the intro. Alright, so let's take a look at the intro patterns. So they're pretty simple here. And if we look at this horn sample, it's kind of just leading the rest of the way. This carries on through the verses, and so if we look at this rhythm, we're on the 1, and then the 15, then the 7, then the 13. So on the 1 and the 13th are kind of hitting on straight 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythms, like quarter notes. But then the 15th on the first pattern and the 7th on the second pattern are kind of giving it an off-kilter feel a little bit instead of it just being straight rhythms. Adds a little bit more intrigue to it. And the other sound we hear is that just ambient sound. And that is triggered on this first pattern right there. But it's actually a very long sample. I took it, know how normally when you load a sample into the drum bank, it wants to chop it up like this. So what I did was I just took it and I went to the trim settings and I just made it carry out through the entire sample. So I just had to trigger it once and it just carries on. And it can go through multiple patterns as we see. And I can just re-trigger it and it behaves like a loop. It's a pretty cool way of doing it. But if we look at the second pattern, because normally the sample carries through, if we look at this, you heard that additional little snippet of the ambient New York sounds, and that's on step 16. And that actually behaves as a choke. It cuts off the sample. And I had to put that there because as we transition from the intro patterns into the verses, I don't want that ambient noise to be there because I want to introduce other elements to the song as we step into the verse, which we're going to take a look at next. Alright, so let's take a listen to these verse patterns. So it's pretty simple. Once again, it's only a 2-pattern chain for the verses, but it's kind of got a lot of complexity to it, so I'm okay looping it around because there's a lot of things that your ear can get attached to in a different way each time you listen through. Whereas like the first time, as you hear the horn line in the intro, perhaps you hear the horn line with the other elements around it in the verses. But then as you continue to listen to it, you hear the other elements as well. So the horn line stays exactly the same. Exact same rhythms, exact same notes, nothing new there. But let's take a look at the bass, because the bass is a little bit interesting here, because it's playing pretty straight. We see that we're in the first column, so we're hitting on the 1, 2, 3, 4, each one of those quarter notes, but then we also are including the third column, which is making these an 8th note rhythm. You'll hear it right here. And so you're hearing that, but it doesn't sound necessarily like, it's not this steady, straight hits. They're straight in their rhythm and sequence, but there's an actual adjustment in the filter for these first ones. It's behaving as if there's side chaining taking place, that there's some surging going on in the bass line. Let me show you guys what I mean. You hear how muffled that first note is in the first column? Listen to this. This is a lot brighter. It's not a drastic difference, but it's enough to kind of behave as the surging sample. And so how I did this was I figured out my bass line. That's it. And what I did was I punched it in and I figured out, okay, these are the notes that are going to be hitting on the first column. And what I do then is I add the filter in. And so I adjust the filter so it's muffled. And then I hit right and I punch in those notes. And then I know that the next notes that are going to be changed are right here, and I change those ones to now the muffled version as well, the kind with the low pass on it. And I proceed to go to the next section, and I figure out which note I need to do, and then I bring down the filter again, and I punch those in, and then I do the same for these. So then I figure out, okay, I need to put a filter on the 7th step right there, or the 7th note. And then same thing for this 13th step. So these are all filtered with a more of the high end taken out by the low pass filter, but these ones have more of it opened up. So it kind of creates this surging bass line to it. Let me show you guys again, just let you listen to it. It's subtle, but you can kind of feel that there's this chugging motion almost to it. It's not necessarily super straight like you would normally hear in some synthwave, but it's kind of this surging vibe to it. And now let's take a look at the other interesting ear candy that we're hearing, and that's a synth line. So it's the same pattern, or the same notes for both patterns. It's the same exact rhythm and everything else. And as you can see, it's pretty busy. It's got a lot going on. We've got some octave jumps and other things. What I did for this was I had to pitch it up for the desired tone I was looking for. So now it's Oh, actually, excuse me, that was a fifth. And you can hear, if we look at this 13th step, or this note, it's kind of carrying on throughout it. It's kind of this bass that we're keeping the jump, we keep jumping back to throughout this line. And that's actually, this right here is the note that is the root of the key. So it's kind of keeping us grounded. Even if the rhythm is kind of a little off kilter, it's still keeping us in place. And it's kind of got that fun feel to it. It added additional energy to it, which I really like. And then we have our drums going on, which are very simple. We just have the kick with the layered hi-hat, and then we have our snare, which is a little bit different than our other snare. I just wanted something that was a little bit different for the verses, that wasn't as dominant. And we hear in the second pattern, we have an open hi-hat. So this behaves as a way of either looping the pattern again or transitioning to the next section, which we're actually going to take a look at in this next section as we go into the build, which are these patterns. However, let's talk about something here, because we have a whole bunch of sounds going on the fourth pattern here. We're using up all 4 tracks, but we're going to be introducing new sounds here in this next pattern. You can hear we've got the ambient New York sounds again, we've got that acid line, and we have the horn playing, but we don't have the bass line that we heard in this pattern, or that kind of like detuned pluck sound. And so what I had to make sure of was adjusting the note length. This is so important if you want to have a lot of complex sounds playing at once. So what I did was I hold down a pattern and I twist this right knob, and you can see it says L5, L4, L2. That's length of the pattern. So now it's going 2 steps. So 1, 2, 1, 2. It's only going to hold out that long, and then it's going to cut itself off. Which means even if I don't have anything else triggered in the next pattern, that it's just going to cut itself off nice and clean there. And the same was needed for the bass line, because the bass, it rings out pretty long, and I didn't want it to ring out at all, so I had to make sure to do the same thing. Have it go length 2 steps, 1, 2. And so that helps keep it clean as we transition. And to keep it so there's still some fluidity behind it all, you can hear that I have the horn line that transitions into the build, which we're going to take a look at next. Alright, so I've kind of shown a little bit of the build thus far, but let's just run through the entire thing. Alright, so I'm personally really proud of this build. It has some awesome feel to it. It got to a point where it kind of felt to me more like not as much synthwave, but almost like something you would hear in like an old Blade movie or something like that, like older 90s, early 2000s, just like intense action scenes where they always had those acid lines going. It's pretty hilarious. So I just kind of went with it. But this is where we introduce ourselves to the main acid line that we hear through the rest of the song. So I can walk through this because this is a pretty incredible pattern, because it only goes the length of one pattern, but it has this feel to it where your ear doesn't get tired of it. And you can hear it. So we're kind of rolling with a pentatonic scale here. I had to pitch it up, as I've done with a lot of my samples, because I don't want any notes lower than that, because that's going to mess with my bass. And so that's the highest note we're going to be playing. And how I get to a minor pentatonic scale on the pocket operator is it's going to be 13, 15, 16, 9, 11. And that replicates itself in this upper area because this is just an octave. So you got, and so you have this good groove that's kind of bluesy going on. You can see each of these is using, I guess there's no fifth in there, but you can see there's sevenths and right there as well. And that's the octave. And so we're using primarily this minor pentatonic scale, and that really plays into both cyberpunk feels, but also just acid lines in general. And the other key thing with a good acid line is kind of having those upper notes, not necessarily hitting right on like steady quarters, but or even eighth notes, but having them hit on what would be kind of like an offbeat feel. So we see that the highest notes are on the 6th step and the 12th step, which are kind of in those 2nd and 4th columns that kind of give it more of that offbeat groove, and that kind of adds that cool energy to it. And so that's a big part of that bass line there. But you also hear is this movement between the patterns. And what I'm doing there is I'm adjusting the filter. I'm holding down right and I'm turning the filter to a high pass. So I have it starting in high pass and I'm holding down right and I'm just twisting the filter up slowly throughout these 4 patterns, recording in this high pass sweep that takes place, which is really something that you hear a lot with acid music, is using the filter to kind of do some sweeping motion to it. And I make sure also that it had pretty high resonance so that you could hear that peak that was shifting, that where the filter is taking place. And when you hear it, it gets to the point where it's super thin and tinny sounding, which is awesome to have right before you go to your drop or your chorus, because then all of the bass comes back in. And so that's just another great tip for having a good build, is utilizing that high pass filter and holding down right and recording it in. And the other sound we hear, once again, we just hear this classic New York City sound again, which you can hear it starts to disappear in these ones. It's because I did the same thing. I held down right and I twisted the high pass filter, removing the lower end and kind of creating this almost like I don't have a riser, so this behaves as my riser, my white noise sound that kind of adds additional energy right before the drop takes place. And the other thing that really stands out that makes this have that real late 90s vibe to it are the drums. We've got these hi-hats that are just hitting steady quarter notes. And then it's the same thing in this pattern. I'm not increasing that. I was tempted to continue to fill them in and give it more and more energy as it got towards the drop, but that wasn't going for the right vibe. I realized when I tried to do that, it just didn't, it started to feel more trappy, and that's not what I wanted at all. And so when we get to this final pattern, instead of having the closed hi-hat, we get to the, which is classic right before some kind of rock break or something that you would have in a rock song or punk rock song. So I thought that was perfect for right before the drop, are those hi-hat, open hi-hats that kind of counted in. And then we have the kick snare combo. That rhythm right there. And you can see that. I'll show you guys how I do it. So you open with the the snare, and then you have a kick, and then a snare, and then on the 14 you have another kick, and then you have 2 snares. And that's all it is. You'll hear that on countless dubstep songs or anything like that. It's a classic kind of drop fill, especially if you don't have other sounds that you can fill it in with. Using just the kick and the snare like that is perfect. And so that's going to do it for the build, and now we're going to take a look at the chorus. So as you all know, the chorus for this song, or the drop, whatever you want to call it, is pretty complicated. You have a few different patterns that are taking place, so let's just take a look at this initial acid, kind of classic cyberpunk type of feel. So I'll just start with triggering these patterns real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this pattern like that. So that's what's going on in this pattern. We have the same acid line that we heard in the build right before the drop. And as you can hear, throughout the chorus, even it builds more and more and more. And let's take a look at this first pattern. We only have 2 sounds going, and that's just the drums and this acid line. And so the real difference here is just in the drums. And we hear a kick, but it has no hi-hat on it. And then we've got our snare, our new snare, which is kind of big and has a lot of presence to it. And then just a close hi-hat on the 3rd row. This is always going to give that offbeat house feel. So if you're doing anything from maybe even as slow as 100 BPM all the way up to maybe 138 if you're doing trance, doing something on this vertical row is really great. It works out really well. It gives it that classic hi-hat feel. So that's all that's going on there. Super, super simple. I refrained from using the kick with the hi-hat for this section just because I wanted the hi-hats that are the offbeat hi-hats to stand out more. And as you know, you hear this other section, which is, it sounds kind of complex, but it's pretty simple actually. All I'm doing is pressing play, and then I'll show you guys actually. So you hit play, but you also need to be in write or edit mode, and you want to have that symbol there, and then you can punch in effects and they're recorded in. So what I did there was just erase the effects. So if you hold down effects in 16, that wipes away any recorded effects on the pattern. And so what we're going to be doing is the 8th note stutter. It's kind of like a tremolo effect, and I thought it sounded perfect for this acid line. So that's what we have going on there. You can just record it in like that. If you don't like it, you can always just press play again and hold and make sure you're in edit mode, and then hold down effects and just erase it by pressing 16. There's a great amount of awesome effects on the POs, especially the PO-33 has awesome ones that mess with the samples. And so that's just what's going on in this section. And we hear this kind of stutter effect, which then transitions us into a higher energy version of the same drop. And so the biggest thing, since we're already on the drums, we hear the drums start to open up here. So we have the same kick and snare, nothing new there, but instead of the closed hi-hat, we have an open hi-hat that's taking place, which is just adding that energy that I always like to have for my choruses. Same thing for the second pattern, but the third pattern, which is the kind of loop around pattern, it changes up a little bit. We have the same kick and snare, and we have the same hi-hat and the same snare right there. However, we can see I did another snare fill here. So I did that. That sound. Obviously I'm not playing it fast enough, but you can hear it kind of behaves as a classic rock fill. So that's what's going on for the drums in this section. And the other sounds that we start to hear is this fake guitar, which is pretty simple really. I have it hitting on the 1 and the 4, kind of hitting in sync with some of the intense accents that we hear in the acid line. And then it has its second iteration. And so let me talk about these. You hear the full open sound, but then I also created this kind of muffled, almost like a palm mute on a guitar. And that's right here. So it's adding this variation in the guitar line, even though I'm only playing and triggering one note. And for this section, it's a double open, but instead of having it ring out, I have this choke. But if I remove the choke, it rings out longer than I want. And so what I'm doing is you just pick a part of the sample that is open, and you can use that as a choke, which I did here. And then also once the open guitar plays again on 8, I have it choked at the 10th step. And we see that in the same, we see the same thing happening for that alternate version of it as well. And the final thing is we hear another acid sweep taking place with the high pass filter, but it's only for one pattern. So I'm holding down right and I'm just sweeping it up really quick for one pattern and I'm writing it in. And if you make a mistake with one of these filter sweeps, you can hold down right and just twist it back to either the start point that you would want to start the sweep, or if you want no filter on, you can just twist it to no filter and hold down right for the entire pattern, and it will make it so there's no filter at play. So that kind of helps us transition into the next section, which we're going to take a look at next. Alright, so now it's time for the final section, which kind of builds off of the classic acid lines, but adds additional mid-tempo type of classic cyberpunk feel. And so let me just punch it in real quick. Let's take a listen. So that's what it is. It sounds pretty awesome. And so what I did was I actually just copy pasted the initial drums and the initial pattern, and then I knew I was going to revamp it and kind of remix it in its own song. So the first section sounds like it's going to be the same, but then we have this dubstep kind of slidey, fluid growl sound. And it just lets us know this is not the same pattern whatsoever. This is a different level to it. So this upper row, this just 1, 2, 3, 4 is the exact same as every other pattern. As we can see, it's still got the classic acid line right there. The drums are the same for that section with the kick without a hi-hat, and then this open hi-hat, and then this snare, but instead of having the open hi-hat here as well, we have just the open snare that rings out the entire time, which lets us know we're changing up it and remixing this pattern. But then we have the new drums step in, which are pretty simple really. It's the same kick without a hi-hat, which is interesting. I'll explain that in a second. And the same snare, but they sound different in this section. And that's because we have these closed hi-hats taking place. And the closed hi-hat, especially falling directly after the snare, gives it a completely different feel. Instead of it ringing out, it's getting choked. It almost feels like it's a different snare entirely that we've repurposed. And so the other thing that's interesting with these hi-hats, I want to see if you guys can tell the difference, is the pitch. We have a pitch change taking place here between the two hi-hats. It's the same hi-hat sound, but I have adjusted the pitch of them just so it kind of adds some variation and intrigue as to keeping it simply straight. So what I did was, this is the lower hi-hat, and this is the higher hi-hat, which I just adjusted the pitch of and punched in. And I did that, and I punched it in, because once you copy it, you can just place it wherever you want. And I did that for the second vertical row and the fourth vertical row. And so it adds that variation, and this is the standard pitch for the hi-hat. And if we look at the other patterns as well, it does the same thing. We have got the higher pitch one right here in the second vertical row and the fourth vertical row, and then the lower pitch hi-hat right here. It kind of gives it that additional feel that kind of gives it almost like a swing, as to just having it be straight hi-hats that would sound almost like they're programmed. Which in this case they are clearly programmed, but at least it kind of gives it variation to your ear that you might not notice unless it was pointed out to you. And you can see it's the same thing for both of these secondary patterns, with the bass that's kind of droning on in the background. And we just have another open snare that kind of closes out both of these patterns. And so that's going to do it for the drums for this section. But when we take a look at let's do the bass, this plucked bass sound, because this adds additional energy to it as well. And it's the exact same thing for all of these. You see that it's just filled in, not on all 4 steps, but only 3. And what this does is kind of give it a fake sidechain effect. We have the kick being present on 9 and 13, and this whole vertical row, same with the snares, and that it kind of makes this fake sidechain effect. Let me see if you guys can hear it. It gives space for the kick and the snare to take place, and then the bass kind of creeps back in. But it's not just me filling it in like this. Check this out. You can hear each one of those patterns, or each one of those samples, I'm messing with the cutoff. So it starts really low for this first vertical row, and then it gets to kind of midway, and you can start to hear some high end, and then it's the full sample exposed, no filter on it whatsoever. So it kind of adds to the sidechain feel as the sound, it makes it sound like the bass has been ducked out and now it's coming back, that it's surging with the kick and the snare. And that's all that's going on there. And as I've done with previous patterns, I made sure that the length was down to 1 step for this, so that when it was done, it didn't just overlap the rest of that bass into this final section. And the same is for this section. And so you also hear some other sounds taking place in this section, and one of which is this weird dubstep mess, kind of like a sad chainsaw or motorbike. But what I have it doing, that's the full sample, but you'll hear here, this one's a little bit faster. And what I did was I removed some of the front end of the sample and I trimmed it. And so I held down, I went to trim, and I adjusted the length so that it was shorter on the front end, and it started about like a quarter of the way through the sample, so that the highest point of the slide happens on the third vertical row with the offbeat, which then becomes the theme as it kind of has that snippet going throughout the rest of the patterns, which I'm going to talk about the other variations, but that's kind of just to help show why I did what I did here with the bass slide. And then it's the same thing, but instead of having it do the full bass slide again on this final pattern, it's just an additional snip, which makes it kind of appear to our ears as if it's a faster slide instead of the slower one. Just like that instead. And so that kind of just helps keep it on that steady offbeat feel. And we hear a variation. I didn't want this to drown out, kind of just get tiring to the ear to listen to. So in the second variation of the secondary pattern, so I had this third step triggered instead at the 3, but then I also have it being triggered at the 4. So it's all about being creative with the sample that you have, because this was originally just going to be a transition effect, but I ended up making it into almost the lead for the section, which is pretty cool. I didn't think I was going to do that at all with it until I started to just mess around with the snippets that it provided for me, because I thought they sounded pretty cool. They had some tonality to them. And you hear another acid line taking place, but it's not this normal acid tone that we've heard throughout everything. It's this kind of longer ringing out, almost like solo style acid line. And it's only taking place on the final row. So it's once again staying within the minor pentatonic. And that's all it's doing. But instead of the note ringing out, as always, I am holding down the note and shortening the length so that it's only one step, so that I'm not having any overlap, because something that everyone runs into when they first get a pocket operator, especially the PO-33, is not knowing that you can only have 4 sounds playing at once, and when you have more than 4, your drums will start to cut out. Whatever's in the drum banks becomes non-existent any longer. So you also hear a similar acid line taking place right here. But once again, it is part of the minor pentatonic scale. And it's stopping in the same way. It's only lasting one step. I adjusted the note length for it. And there's one final sound we're hearing. So you hear that slipping of the bass here, but in the second pattern, the second variation of the second pattern, it's this kind of plucked tone. That's really all I'm doing, is triggering the same note 4 times, but I'm once again sweeping the filter. Let me show you guys real quick. Oh wait, here we go. Do you hear all those different harmonics that you can pick out? What I did was I found ones that sounded good for the first step, and then I punched it in. Found one for the second step, and then completed that process until I was at the highest point, which is right there. So it creates this kind of surging effect again with the high pass filter taking place, kind of giving it a kind of dubsteppy growl, but it's not necessarily too dubsteppy. And so that's kind of like that final transition sound. And as always, with the melodic, anything in the melodic bank, I always try and adjust the note length so it lasts as long as the pattern and doesn't trail into other patterns that we have playing. And so that makes it easy to transition to our first pattern. So just like that, you have that steady, clean transition back into the final pattern. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it's been very beneficial to you guys, and you've learned a lot of great stuff on how this track was made, and hopefully some stuff you can apply to your own music as well, whether on a pocket operator or elsewhere. If you guys are interested in more tutorials, you can check them out here, or if you want to watch any of my other pocket operator videos, they are available here as well. I hope you guys have a great day. See you next time.